Welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Transfer, Translation and Reuse Between Faiths, a View from Medieval Iberia. My name is Esther Miriam-Wagner. I'm the Executive Director of the Woolf Institute, and I'm also Editor-in-Chief of Al-Masaq. Al-Masaq is a copy of Al-Masaq, which is the journal of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, which is a fantastic journal. It comes as part of the subscription comes as part of the membership of the Society, and I know that Antonella will talk a little bit more about the Society later. This is the second webinar in a series of collaborations between the Woolf Institute and the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. For those of you who don't know the Woolf Institute, we are a research institution. We focus on religion and society, and we combine our research with teaching, public education, and policy work. Most of our research is concerned with contemporary social sciences, but we also understand the importance of approaching all topics from a historical perspective. And therefore, quite a few of our students and affiliated researchers, and also myself, we all work on historical themes. So a quick introduction of how this webinar works. I can see from the names that have popped up as attendees, quite a few colleagues are there, quite a few students that we know. It's really, really wonderful to have you all here, to have such a great audience. We're also live streaming via Facebook. If you want to rewatch this or recommend it to someone, it will be available from the Woolf Institute's Facebook page. And from tomorrow or early next week, it will also be available on YouTube and from the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean Facebook pages. So as for the structure, we'll have a panel discussion of 20 to 25 minutes. Each speaker has been asked to prepare 3 minutes of introduction to that topic. And then we'll have a short discussion among ourselves where you can prepare some questions for the Q&A session that will last about 25 to 30 minutes, which we'll have after the presentations. You can type in your questions on the Q&A portal, which is at the bottom of your screens. Please do type them into the Q&A and not into the chat, as it makes it much, much easier for the chair to handle the questions that come in. And this is the right time to introduce the chair for this evening, Dr. Antonella Perry from the University of Lincoln, who is the co-president of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. Antonella works on the cultural history of medieval Iberia, and I hand right over to you, Antonella.
Thank you, Miriam. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar organized by the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean and kindly sponsored by the Woolf Institute. First of all, I would like to say just a few words about the Society that Miriam already introduced, and said that obviously we've got Al-Masaq attached to the Society that is dedicated to the study, the academic study of the medieval Mediterranean from the point of view of history, obviously, and culture more broadly, and covering the period from the 5th to the 15th century. Please do check our renewed website for more information. We also offer a number of scholarship and prizes, and especially for the career scholars. And there are loads of more opportunities, as well as our biennial conference, the forthcoming one happening in 2021. In Crete. So please do check our website, have a look at the membership, and do feel free to sign up. This is kind of shameful advertisement, but I think it's important to do that. Today, we are going to talk about transfer, translation, and reuse between faith. I should say that one of our speakers is currently having some technical issues, so I'm going to introduce the speakers briefly in a minute, and I will introduce her also because she is the mind behind this webinar, and hopefully she will be able to actually access the session if her internet and computer allow her. So first of all, today really the key discussion is going to be about a number very different aspects, and this session will really explore 4 different examples of interfaith transfer and reuse of object, text, material culture, and we will talk about also the movement of people from Islamic Al-Andalus to the Christian kingdoms of Iberia. Our panelists today are 4 brilliant early career scholars whose work has actually inspired this session and will inform our further discussion. I'll introduce them in order of appearance. So we will start with Dr. Esther Dorado Ladero. Esther is an architect. She completed her PhD in Theory and History of Architecture at the Barcelona School of Architecture in 2015, with a thesis on the symbolic value of geometric ornamentation in medieval Iberian architecture, and she currently works as a science communication specialist in Barcelona. Welcome, Esther, and thank you for attending this session. She will be followed by Dr. Maeve O'Donnell Morales. Maeve completed her PhD on Castilian altar furnishing in 2018 at the Woolf Institute of Art, and she's currently a research associate at the University of Bristol, investigating the development of the cult of Hispanic saints as part of a broader AHRC interdisciplinary grant. Then, finger crossed, our 3rd speaker will be able to join in, and she's Dr. Teresa Whitcomb. She is the organizer of this session. She completed her PhD from the University of Exeter in 2019, and she's now a Liverpool Visiting Research Fellow at the CSIC, the Spanish National Research Council. We can still not hear you, but hopefully we will. And she works on the intellectual, cultural, and religious history of Castile, in particular between the 12th and 13th centuries, and on the movement of ideas and individuals between Muslim and Christian societies. And then last but not least, we'll have Dr. Clara Almagro. She completed her PhD at the University of Granada in 2012, and she's currently a researcher at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, where she's the recipient of a very prestigious DFG funded research project on actually some of the topics that she's going to discuss today. So as Miriam has explained before, we're going to give each speaker about 3 minutes where they're going to briefly introduce their projects, their chosen topics for today, and then we start having a conversation and a debate. Please, just as a reminder, please do use the Q&A portal on your screens. Don't type your questions in the chat because I'm kind of multifunction, but not that much, so I might not actually see all your questions otherwise. So thank you very much in advance, and we'll start geographically actually from the eastern part of the Iberian Peninsula with our first speaker, Esther, who is going to consider the pragmatic reasons and the symbolic values of the recycle, reuse, repurposing of architecture within the Iberian context. So how were buildings appropriated, reused, reshaped, by whom and why? And she will shed some light on these very important questions, needless to say, the echo of which are very contemporary in the current Mediterranean and global context. And she's going to focus on the Christian reuse of the Alcaferia Palace in Zaragoza. Esther.
So hello everyone, and thank to the organizers for the invitation and for Antonella for the introduction. As she said, I'm going to talk about the Alcaferia Palace. I'll try to share my screen just to show you a couple of images, just in case you don't know the building. The Alcaferia was built in the 11th century as a country residence by Al-Muqtadir, which was one of the most important rulers of the Taifa of Zaragoza. And if we move forward less than a century, Alfonso I conquered the city in 1118, and a community of Benedictine monks was established in the building. We know from the mid-13th century, it was used as a royal residence, and from then on, the building, there you go. From then on, the building suffered periods of neglect and also major refurbishments and additions to this day. So after this extremely brief introduction, I want to focus on three aspects that I think are interesting for the topic today, and then maybe we can discuss further in the Q&A if you're interested. So first of all, the Christian kings or monarchies from the northern kingdoms had a very diverse approach, very different approach over the Middle Ages to the Hispanic Muslim buildings in Al-Andalus or in the peninsula in general. And also that approach depended on many different factors. The more clear ones, if you like, the clearest ones would be sociological, economic, political circumstances in each period, or also the technical requirements resulting from the continuous movement of the borders. But I think other more subtle factors are also important. For instance, the personal preferences of the kings, or if they use art and architecture for propaganda purposes in their reigns. So, for instance, two most important Christian interventions in the palace really were undertaken by Pere Ceremonius and Fernando the Catholic in different periods, obviously. In the case of Pere the Ceremonius, I think he just loved the place. So he took a personal interest, he was involved actively in the works, and he took attention to every detail of the intervention. On the other hand, for Fernando the Catholic, the Alcaferia was just one of many, many buildings in his kingdoms that could be used as a display of power within a general political strategy. So that would be my first point. My second point is that in this type of discussion, we tend to consider Hispanic Muslim architecture as a whole. But the truth is that Andalusian buildings built in different periods and in different styles were also treated very differently by the same people. So going back to the Catholic monarchs I just mentioned, they disregarded and overshadowed the Alcaferia with their additions, but on the other hand, at the same period, they treated quite respectfully the Alhambra in the newly conquered Granada, for instance. And the last but not least, my third point is that beyond the practical use of the Alcaferia, the preservation of the building beyond the Middle Ages was key for the architectural development in the area. So Mudéjar builders had access firsthand to Taifa architecture in the late Middle Ages, and that ensured the the survival, if you like, of the Taifa technical tradition and architectural tradition. And what's more interesting in this debate today is that it also favored the transfer of an entire visual culture that all the communities living in the area adopted as part of their own heritage, regardless of their faith. So for instance, very complex geometrical patterns that were used in the 11th century in the plaster works of the palace that have been preserved to this day were adapted to be used in the mural paintings in Mudéjar churches in the 14th and 15th century. And that would be it from me.
Need to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Esther. That was brilliant and perfectly within the time limit. We will leave then space for questions afterwards. So we go now on to talking about, alongside obviously the reuse and adaptation of buildings, we can actually track the circulation of objects of different sorts that were transported, inherited, donated, exchanged, sold for different uses and purposes. And our next speaker will discuss in particular the question of Andalusi and Eastern textile in Christian contexts, especially in support of the idea that local contexts are essential to understand the reception of Islamic materials by Christian viewers. And she's going to discuss this question with reference to a specific object, the textile inside the casket in San Millán de la Cogolla. So Maeve, I'm sorry, you can tell it's been okay. a long day.
I told you that it sounds like Dave, so that's fine. I'm just going to share my screen as well, so you have a couple of pictures. And and I'll get started. Can you see that? Okay. So thank you, Antonella, Miriam, Teresa, and the Woolf Institute for organizing this webinar and inviting me to participate. As Antonella mentioned, I'm currently researching the 11th century reliquary casket of Saint Emilion, which you see here on your screen, and which continues to be held at its original home at the monastery of, I think if I do that, then you don't see that. San Milan de la Cogolla in La Rioja, northeastern Spain. Though I'm specifically interested in the link between the casket's ivories and liturgy for this saint's feast day in the 11th century, the casket is one of many in northern Iberia that is lined with a luxurious silk textile. This textile in particular has been identified by specialists as a mid-11th century silk, likely made in a southern Taifa kingdom such as Seville or Cordoba. As I've learned recently when presenting my work, many people still feel that the presence of this Islamic fabric in a Christian reliquary must be tied to conflicts between these faiths on the peninsula. And yet scholars have for the last few decades shown that the idea that so-called Islamic textiles should be seen as necessarily tied to conflict makes too many assumptions. As many of you know, these assumptions include, firstly, that Islam and its people were seen and understood by Iberian Christians as a homogeneous whole. Secondly, that the only way that materials, objects, and people moved across the frontier between North and South, as if there was only one, whereas as war booty or as a result of conquest. And thirdly, that Islamic materials in Christian contexts could only be seen by medieval Christians as political statements, their other theological, spiritual, or economic meanings being completely obscured by the polemical. In correcting these three assumptions, it's often necessary to focus on the local and on individual cases, and that is what I intend to do in my work. With regards to the second point, how my textile got to San Milan, this is really the most difficult question to answer. Indeed, it's near impossible to trace the exact route and multiple stages of exchange that most, I'll just stop so you can see me, that most textiles went through before arriving into Northern ecclesiastical collections. Recent scholarship has shown, however, that the cases of war booty were rare and often exaggerated in later chronicles. Rather, circulation appears to have more often taken the form of gifts between allies, sometimes Christians and Muslims, and simply as trade and commerce. And indeed, I have examples of these two forms of exchange occurring at San Milan in the 10th and 11th centuries. The third issue, that is, what the meaning of the textile, what the meaning was of the textile to audiences at San Milan in particular, is, I think, more interesting and important, especially in terms of the creation of meaning on local level. It is also rather complex for this mini introduction. So in brief and in conclusion, this textile did not represent the conversion of conquest of Islamic people and objects, pursuits that do not seem to have been of particular interest to the community of monks at San Milan. Instead, the textile does two things, both related to the function of reliquaries. It encases the saint's body in brilliant light-reflecting material that expresses the miraculous and transcendental powers of the saint's remains. And it took part in the reconstruction and celebration of communal memory associated with the history of the cult at this site in particular. The casket, we believe, was made for the monastery's new Romanesque church down the hill from the historic site where the saint is believed to have lived. And many of the casket's ivories were carefully designed to represent the history of the cult at the older church up the hill, which evidence shows was a richly ornamented space containing structural and decorative elements, including dense geographic and floral carvings, some of which had Andalusian parallels or distant origins. The incorporation of the textile was thus not an allusion to a different external culture, but to another time, the earlier time that is of the cult as celebrated in the older aesthetically distinct church. At least that's one possibility. I'm happy to discuss more. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Maeve. Now, we are going to skip for the time being our third presentation.
Do you hear me?
Because yes. Teresa, can you hear us? We can't see you, but we
Yes,
can hear you now.
I hear you.
Fantastic.
I hear you. Do you hear and see me?
But we can hear you. Fantastic. Brilliant. Then I can introduce you. Teresa finally managed to connect, and she's going to talk about text and ideas that obviously also circulated widely within the peninsula, across the Mediterranean and beyond. Texts that were, as we know, often translated, hence adopted and adapted to the new context of reception. Teresa, she will talk in particular about very interesting example that she's currently working on, and is a text written by the 12th century Berber scholar and reformer Ibn Tumard, and what happened with that text in Christian Toledo. This study and this case study in particular, among others, I think is also important for us as a reminder that the study of the Iberian Peninsula cannot be and should not be done in isolation, and we need to look at broader Mediterranean and European context at the same time to fully understand the cross-fertilization and mutual influences that we can detect in text. So, Teresa, finally, it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Antonella, and I hope you can see me now as well.
Yes.
Great. The moral of the story is never to try and fix problems immediately before. I was trying to fix my audio, but I obviously broke it further. Well, as Antonella mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the transfer and the translation of texts between the Muslim and Christian worlds of 13th century Iberia. It is, of course, well known that the 12th and 13th centuries were a time when vast amounts of learning, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and science were translated from Arabic to Latin, and that a lot of this translation activity happened in and around Toledo. These texts included the scholars of antiquity, most of all Aristotle, but also a great number of Muslim scholars, Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Averroes, Al-Batruji, Al-Farabi, and many more were translated into Latin and prized highly by the Christian society into which they were received. The question I want to pose this evening, now that I'm able to, is how did Christian scholars and writers repackage and represent these texts and their Islamic provenance in order to make them acceptable to a Christian audience? What process or what means of claiming or justifying were necessary in order to incorporate this edifice of Islamic learning and scholarship into Christian scholarly discourse? One strategy to do this was to claim that this learning was originally Christian. And we see an example of this in Bishop Lucas of Tuy, who was writing in 13th century Leon, who claimed that the works of Avicenna had actually been written by the Christian saint Isidore of 7th century Seville, and had been stolen and handed to Avicenna, who had translated them into Arabic and inserted some errors and claimed them as his own. So that's one way in which this was rationalized. However, the figure I want to look at today, as Antonella said, is Ibn Tumard, whose teachings were translated in Toledo in 1213. Ibn Tumard had died in 1130. He was the Mahdi, or spiritual leader, of the Almohad Empire. That was the ruling Muslim power in southern Spain and North Africa at this point. In 1213, his teachings were translated into Latin by Mark, a canon of Toledo Cathedral. It is worth pointing out that this was a period of ongoing war between Castile and the Almohads, including a major battle just 1 year earlier in 1212. Ibn Tumard is mentioned in two different chronicles from the 13th century, from Castile in the 13th century, where we see him presented as a philosopher from Baghdad and also as a wise and discreet man, even though an infidel. However, even more interesting are the words of the translator, Mark himself. On completing the translation of Ibn Tumard's text, Mark wrote a prologue explaining and to some extent justifying what he had done. And his presentation of Ibn Tumard here is very eye-catching. Mark tells us that other Muslims don't accept Ibn Tumard's teachings, not even all of the Almohads. The translator deliberately draws a comparison between Ibn Tumard's teachings and the Quran. Muslims accept the Quran, he says, but they don't accept Ibn Tumart. Mark, the translator, then goes further, and he tells us that Ibn Tumart himself was not actually a good Muslim, possibly not even really a Muslim at all. He tells us that Ibn Tumart, I quote, did not believe in the law, i.e. Islam, the lex, because he was a disciple of the philosopher Al-Ghazali. Discerning men, he tells us, should know that Ibn Tumart was not therefore a purus maurus, a true Muslim. So Mark seems to me to be justifying his translation by setting Ibn Tumart apart from the Islamic world, effectively neutralizing this text's Islamic identity in order to claim its contents for use in a Christian context. This is underpinned by the suggestion that, as a philosopher, he can't also be a good Muslim. So that's my contribution to this debate, and I'm really interested to see how this compares with what the other three have to say. And I have heard you, just couldn't be visible earlier, and how it compares to ways in which other things were claimed or reused between Islamic and Christian worlds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. This was very interesting. And now, last but not least, we are going to talk about the movement of people, because none of actually these exchanges would have been possible without people moving across boundaries, across borders. Whether voluntarily or by coercion is a different story. And that's the story that our next speaker is going to focus on, whose current research actually investigates the movement of people related to the territorial conquest from the 13th to the 15th century, and in particular with the forced movement of people, of slaves and captives from Al-Andalus, and also the effort that was made to prevent the movement of population the other way around, towards the south and towards Al-Andalus. So Clara, for you.
Thank you very much, Antonella, and thank you, Teresa, for the invitation. I will be indeed talking about people as facilitators for this reuse and these adaptations that we see of Islamic components into the Christian kingdoms, because these things don't happen in a vacuum. As it's a very wide topic, I will be using my current research project, which is about Muslims who were under the rule of military orders in the Iberian Peninsula. And I will focus on two ideas, which are the two ways in which Muslims can be found in relation to military orders. On the one hand, we have what I would call as a shorthand as unwilling contributors, or which would be the unfree Muslims, the ones who are coerced to go to live in lands of military orders in their houses and work for them. These would be most commonly captives of war and slaves. Captivity of war was a very common occurrence in the Iberian Peninsula during the Middle Ages, and military orders were not an exception. They did partake into these activities. Some of them, for example, the Order of Santiago went as far as funding hospitals to channel this kind of exchange of captives and revenue that was created through that. But the orders benefited from this, not only from the money that this could create, but also from the work of these captive Muslims who were, if they were not redeemed, they could become slaves of the orders or unfree workers for the orders, together with those who were bought in the markets. These Muslims can be found in almost every convent, castle, house, partaking in all kinds of tasks. Sadly, we don't know much about, we are not given much information at what explicitly they were doing there, because it's not important for the orders to say it. But we know that they not only work in the fields, but they were inside the houses. They worked as builders, they worked as cooks, they worked as bakers. So their imprint, and they were present in the houses. And in some cases, even these unfree Muslims could take roles of responsibility. We have, for example, an example of one Muslim who we think was unfree, who was in charge of one of the fortresses of the Order of St. John. But also, together with these unfree collaborators, we have free Muslims who work for military orders. We have free Muslims who work in these same houses as tax collectors, as administrators, as brokers with other powers, or facilitating commercial exchanges. And also, this not to be forgotten, the Muslims who live on the land, who are also very beneficial for the orders because they produce income. They are a workforce that in lands that are not populated by Christians yet. And as such, the military orders take measures to make their lands attractive for them. So they stay because they're free to go away. They are free to go back to a lands under Islamic rule as they were supposed to do. And also they are free to move to other lordships. So they have to make their lands attractive to them in a number of ways. And through these processes, we have seen that some of the structures that these communities had in place from before the conquest carry over after the conquest. And they survive through the Middle Ages with transformations because they don't completely fit with the new lordship. So throughout the 13th to 15th centuries, we find all kinds of aspects of their lives and of their organization that live on and at the same time are deeply transformed, that go from settlement to taxes to the way they organize themselves, and also things as simple as how they eat, and that is in turn translated to the Christian neighbors and their lords. And that's my contribution for now.
Excellent, thank you very much. Excellent, thanks, Clara. Fantastic. Now, I would suggest that, well, all the speakers, if they want to unmute themselves, and we can start a conversation. I actually would like to start already with the questions because I've noticed that we already have a few in the Q&A session, and I remind everyone, if you've got questions or comments, please do put them on the Q&A chat box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. So one of the questions was for Maeve, and it was about the idea of textiles as evocative of earlier times. And it's Kirsty who's asking whether you can perhaps elaborate a little bit more on that aspect.
Yeah, it's just a theory. Like, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's not my principal feeling about this textile. The two things that I said that the textile does in wrapping the relic in a brilliant textile or in a brilliant material is, I think, maybe more to the point, because there is a problem about visibility. The relic was closed. It had a small place where you could open it to look inside, but the opening isn't easy either. So it wouldn't be seen very much. I think the textile is doing a lot more that has to do with what reliquaries do, which is to encase the body of the saint in a manner that expresses its miraculous abilities and its abilities to bridge heaven and earth. The idea that it may allude to the earlier times is something that I'm playing around with now, because we think that the reliquary was made for the new building. There's a lot of parts of the ivories, details in the ivories that allude to the history of the cult and the site. There's even specific representations of other objects used in the cult at this site. So I thought, since the building upstairs was up the hill was so richly ornamented, it would make sense to continue with that and richly ornament every aspect of the casket as well. And indeed, we know that that was the case. So in this way, I think it's not about looking at the textile as part of sort of historiographic academic discussion about North and South, but to look at how the monks were using art in the late 11th century at this place. And I think it fits more in what they were doing there, which was to commemorate their history through art rather than this other thing. So.
Thank you. I continue with the questions in the chat. There are actually quite a few. So I'm actually going to go to the question that Rodrigo Garcia Velasco is asking, because it was the question that I was going to ask our speakers, and it's for the four of them. So and it's about how, I'm reading from Rodrigo's questions. Actually was wondering whether the speakers could elaborate on talk a little bit on how we approach medieval Iberian interreligious contact from a methodological point of view. In other words, is there anything intrinsically Iberian about such contacts? What are the main ways in which the cultures of Iberia are different or distinctive, and in what ways they fit within broader European and Mediterranean epicenters? So if each of you can give your views on such a very broad question.
I guess I'll start since I'm still not muted, and then I'll mute myself. I think in my case, I find that methodologically focusing on the local is really important. You know, you want to find, medieval Iberians were complicated. People with thoughts and tastes that they may not even have understood, less we should. And I think it's always prudent to look for evidence specific to a community about what their interests were, what their concerns were, how they used material, how they interacted with people. That said, I think the work like of Clara and Teresa in terms of text can bring around a paradigm shift. Maybe we will have our eyes open to an entire population that we haven't been thinking about, like free slaves, or a different type of text that no one has looked at. And then we'll have to go back and readjust. But I think it's always a balance between those two things.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree. Just with relation to what I've just been talking about, I mean, it does clearly fit into a broader context. But the question of how to receive these texts and what to make of them is one that Europeans were grappling with all over, and it is answered in different ways in different places and at different times. The reception of Avicennan texts into the University of Paris, for example, at exactly this time is far more problematic. They're not trying, well, the edicts of 1210 and 1215 that ban the teaching of what appear to be Avicennan commentaries clearly are taking a different approach to the sorts of arguments that are in the text of Ibn Tumat. So yeah, it all needs to be considered in relation, of course, and texts are moving between Castile, Paris, and a much wider circuit. And that's something that actually I think needs a lot more work, is how these texts did move and how scholars were connected through these networks. But that would be my contribution.
Thank you, Teresa.
Yeah, in my project, as I am looking at the whole Iberian Peninsula at the moment, I'm looking at Portugal, Castile, and the Crown of Aragon. I find that, at least in my experience, up to what I've seen, you do have some, for us, so to say, overarching interests, especially in institutions such as military orders who are present everywhere, and they do have common trends. And I suspect that in the case of the Templars and the Hospitallers, they most probably go beyond the Iberian Peninsula, and they could be applicable to the other areas of the Mediterranean. Sadly, I cannot attest it. But then the implementation itself is very local, and it's very determined by the external factors in every case, which is very interesting to see and makes the analysis very complicated and very rich, because you have one kind of goal that they seem to share, but the way that they get to it is all the colors of the rainbow and all the ways that they can see. So there's a combination of both that is really, really rich and interesting and has to be taken into account.
Yeah, I obviously agree with the other contributions. I would also say, in the aspect of studying the local, I think it's very important. In architecture, for instance, it's really, Mudéjar architecture, for instance, depends on a great basis on the chronological advance of the Christian conquest. So Islamic architecture would be taken as an example to simplify it, to oversimplifying this. But obviously, those examples would depend on the time when the Christian conquest happened and on the golden age, if you like, of those territories. So for instance, in Seville, it would be Almohad architecture, what imprinted everything. And as I said in my presentation, in the northern kingdom of Aragon, it would be the Taifa architecture that was the most important Islamic in the area. So we call it all the same Mudéjar, but local implementation is very important. And I would also add that I tend to find a trap, if you like, to always talk about Islamic and Christian, whatever, in opposition. So I think it's, as Clara said before, all the colors of the rainbow between full collaboration and the most cruel opposition all over the Middle Ages, even after the 13th century. There was a great collaboration at some points, I think, and that would be it from me.
Thank you very much to all our speakers for this. Well, we could, I think, have a separate webinar just on these questions, which might be an idea. But I would follow up with another question specifically for Esther in this case, but it kind of follows up a little bit in terms of methodology, but also how we approach the study of such a complex reality. The question is about actually, so there's a question from JD Rosa, who's working on the Albarracín Cathedral and would like to know what actually key critical theoretical terms she should be looking at when thinking about churches built on the site of mosques. So she's saying, should we use words such as appropriation, mediation, transculturations are broadly what she has been looking at. Any new ideas? So the question of terminology is one that actually we were informally discussing yesterday with the speakers, and it came up through this question. So maybe we can start with Esther, but if anyone else wants to comment on this, please do feel free.
Okay, so at the risk of being a bit controversial, I think it's obviously very different, the buildings that have been preserved. So famously the Mosque of Cordoba, for instance, where you have the Islamic structure is very present. So obviously two cathedrals, one Gothic and one in Mari style, were embedded within the Islamic structure. And for instance, in the case of Seville, we have lost the mosque, but the sun, so the courtyard, if you like, and the minaret are preserved. So, and that's a big presence. So I think when after, depending on the case, many years, many centuries, the mosque was demolished to a certain extent to build a new Gothic, whatever style cathedral. I think it's just a practical issue. Probably the structures of the, obviously another thing, in Islamic cities, the main mosque took such an important place in the city and such a big place that it's really difficult to be replaced by anything else than a big community building. And also all the structure of the streets would get to the mosque. I think it was a practical issue as well. Obviously, a lot of mosques were built on top of busy Gothic churches or even previous temples. So I think it's a question of practical issues. Obviously, there's all this symbolic thing. There are Islamic remains in cathedrals that it's surprising actually that things were kept, like the mihrab in some cathedrals, etc. But I think it's important to look at the practical side as well. So it was, if the foundations were good, why shouldn't we use them over again, etc. I hope that that's enough.
Thank you. Are there any other comments from the speakers, or shall I move on to another question among the many? So I apologize if I skip some just because there's so many. So there's a question for Teresa from David Toroyo, who is currently working on translations from Arabic into Hebrew in medieval Iberia. And he's saying that the same idea of stolen or lost knowledge belonging originally to the Jewish people as a justification to translate from Arabic and then reintroduce that knowledge into the Jewish canon is very common in many Hebrew works. So the question for Teresa is, have you actually found that justification to be widespread in Christian texts translated from Arabic, or do you think this is an isolated instance in the specific case of Ibn Tumar text?
Oh, that sounds absolutely fascinating, that work that you're doing, David. Thank you for the question. Well, I'm at the start of a project of looking at various prologues to translations, and I have worked on Ibn Tumar so far, and I only have that one instance from Lucas of Twi that actually refers specifically to an individual scholar. However, I think the idea does go more broadly, and you do see references to that kind of rhetoric, and also interestingly the other way around. So there's a scholar, Ibn Abdun, from early 12th century Seville, who was writing to say that it should be prohibited to give Islamic texts to the Christians because they translate them and pretend that they're their own. So it's something that seems to be, everybody seems to be conscious of this. It's a powerful rhetoric that we also see applied to things like churches. For example, Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada talks about our churches have been stolen and turned into mosques. We need to go and take them back. So, yeah, I think it's part of a wider rhetoric, really. But the extent to which it's used for specific ideas and texts is something that I'm hoping to follow up. And I'd be really interested to know more about your work, actually, if that's something that's widespread in Arabic, Hebrew translation.
Thank you, Teresa. There are plenty of questions, which is, sorry?
Sorry, Maeve was just waving. I don't know if she had a follow-up to that question too.
Okay.
I just wanted to, I wanted to pick up on the mention of Jimenez de Rada, because it's funny because he had a lot of textiles. Yeah, he owned a great deal of silk textile. And so I think there's also a distinction to be made between the narrative voice in texts, chronicles, introductions to chronicles, which we all know have their own special self-aware advertisements of humility and this and that, and and practice, because for example, with Jimenez de Rada, he was buried in a southern textile, he wore it around, so I think that methodologically is also a big thing. The difference between material evidence and what it's telling us, practical matters, like Esther just made such a good point about the practical matters of church building, and texts, texts that say, I took over this mosque, hooray, there's sometimes a huge disbalance between those two types of sources, I think.
Thank you. Just to follow up on this, there was another question for Teresa, and it was about actually this description of and it's from Claire O'Brien, about the idea of the philosopher as someone who can be a good Muslim, at least in this context. So Claire is asking whether did Christian translators have the same view that as a philosopher, one can be a good Christian? And if you can expand a little bit more on that.
I've unmuted myself. Is that, you can hear me now?
Yeah.
That's a wonderful question, and a very complicated one to answer. But there have been the use of philosophy and the work of scholars has historically been at times considered suspect. Like I was saying earlier, the reception of certain texts into the University of Paris was problematic at the start of the 13th century. So yes, that there's always the potential for fault lines there. I think that's all I'll say on that for now, because I'm aware that we're really short of time. But yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. There's also another, well, there are plenty of questions. So there's also another question for Esther, and is about the geometric patterns on, I lost the questions. I'm really sorry. I'm really bad at kind of, I lost the questions. Oh yes, from Marina Schneider. She was asking, that moved again? Okay, she was asking about the geometric patterns that you were talking about before, and whether you think that the patterns from Islamic buildings were altered for new Christian context, but whether you think were the patterns actually altered, or what was happening basically there?
Yeah. So obviously it's very difficult to generalize, and there were patterns that were more popular in Mudéjar workshops than others. But in the case of the Alcaferia, what I was talking about was that geometric ornamentation that was originally executed in plaster, which is a very different technique from mural painting, obviously needed to be adapted to this way of drawing it, or the way of executing it. It needed to be adapted to another whole technique. And they were not very complex, but they were quite particular. And another good example I can give from the Alcaferia is that the northern rooms are separated from the courtyard by this very, very typical, more than typical, typical, really, really different, if you like, mixed linear arches. And those arches also were transformed into a specific pattern, quite similar to Sebka, which is an Islamic pattern, in mural painting as well. So you see that things that these Mudéjar builders saw the Taifa building were, for lack of a better word, adapted to be used as ornamentation in, more than anything, in mural paintings, but also in brick facades. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Esther. I've got a question for Clara, and it's about whether we know anything. You were saying there's variety, there's difference, but I do wonder whether we got any references in terms of the slaves, the people that were in captivity, and whether there's any reference to women and what's happening with women in this context, and if you can expand upon that a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are women. There are many fewer women than men, which makes sense because, in fact, there's, for example, the order of the Templars does have a regulation saying that women should not have female slaves in their houses. But then the Templars also have women, only fewer. What I have found is that these women do not appear to be as visible as men as well, which makes it more difficult to trace their presence, because male workers for the orders, either free or unfree, have a wider range of roles they're playing, while women, we cannot be, we don't know, but as we don't have information otherwise, we think they were just manual work or maybe in the houses, which is for the ones writing the records not so relevant. So we know they are there. We don't know who they are. They appear mostly in inventories where they say there were 3 Mouras or 3 Saracenas or something like that. But otherwise, except for the cases where they run away or they're manumitted, we don't have names or any other kind of personal information about them.
Thank you, Clara. Esther has got a hand up.
Yeah, can I be very cheeky and ask something to Clara? So just a very quick question. Do you have any evidence of these Islamic slaves or captives working in construction, in architecture? Because I've never seen that. I've seen that a lot in modern architecture, yeah, but in Christian styles, if you like.
Well, come to mind the Order of Calatrava in their convent. They had seven servants that had to be how do you say it, given to the convent for serving, and there were usually Muslims. And one of them is the Master of Works, the Obrero. So there was there, and also in Portugal, in the, I think it's Aljustrel, there's a castle of the Order of Santiago that has, I don't know exactly, but there's a plaque in there from the time that says that a Muslim man built the castle, and it gives the name. Those are the only examples that come to mind, but I think it would have been quite common to have Muslims contributing to the work and the construction. The thing is, we don't have a record for that, but seeing how present they are everywhere, at least the upkeeping of the buildings would probably have been done by them. Also, through the free Muslims who live on the land usually have obligations of work, and it's not described exactly what, but it's quite possible that just as they have to contribute to the upkeeping of the walls, they could also be used for upkeeping of the houses and other infrastructures of the order. Does that answer?
That's fantastic. Unfortunately, it's 7 p.m., which means I have to pass the word to Miriam and at least close the live session that is going on Facebook. However, if you, and I'm talking to everyone and all the attendees, if you would like to hang on for a few more minutes after the live session is concluded, we can actually go through the other questions that were in the chat, and we didn't have time just to discuss within the time period. So please hang on if you can, because we can continue the discussion a bit more informally and not being live on Facebook. So Miriam?
Yeah, I think I need to we need to wrap up, but I need to also extend a massive apology for a massive mistake I made earlier. I addressed my dear colleague and friend Antonella with the wrong double-barreled Italian name. So our chair today was Antonella Liuzzo Scorpo, not any other name I may have mentioned. So thank you all very, very much. As Antonella said, we will stay here for the webinar attendees, so you will be able to see us. We'll just finish up the live session on Facebook. So I want to thank all our speakers very, very much. I've had a lot of very, very positive comments on the various media. Thank you also very much, Antonella, for chairing this so supremely. It was really, really great fun to have all of us with you here. We say goodbye now to our Facebook audience. Thank you very much for watching this. I hope you have learned as much as I have. All the best and stay safe.